They laughed. They mocked. They called it Carney's fantasy. When Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament to unveil his first-ever national budget, even members of his own party looked uneasy. A $78 billion deficit, sweeping cuts to the public service, and promises of supercharged growth? It sounded absurd. But that was before the chaos began. Before the numbers started to move. Before Canada's financial pulse shifted in ways nobody could explain. At first, the headlines were brutal. Carney's budget gamble, Canada can't afford it. Economists sound alarm, spending spree or strategic play. The opposition leader laughed on camera, calling it the biggest fiscal illusion in modern Canadian history. Even the American media took shots, one Fox Business host saying, "Carney thinks he's Trudeau with a PhD." But Carney didn't flinch. He stood calmly before reporters, repeating just 5 words. "You'll understand soon enough." Days turned into weeks. And then, something strange happened. Reports emerged that foreign investors were quietly pouring billions into Canadian infrastructure bonds. No one knew why. The Bank of Canada's data showed an unexplained spike in capital inflows, money coming from anonymous overseas accounts. At the same time, the Canadian dollar began to rise, defying every analyst prediction. It didn't just recover from Trump's tariff threats, it strengthened. And that's when people started whispering. Did Carney know something others didn't? Inside Ottawa, insiders described an eerie calm around the Prime Minister's office. Officials claimed Carney was tracking a hidden data model, something developed years ago during his time at the Bank of England, a system that could forecast trade shocks before they happened. One leaked memo, later denied by the government, suggested Carney had run economic simulations involving a U.S. tariff collapse and a European energy crisis, both predicted to occur within the same quarter. 3 weeks later, both events hit. Trump's new tariff bill was rejected in the U.S. Senate, throwing Washington's trade agenda into disarray. Simultaneously, energy prices in Europe skyrocketed due to a gas shortage. And suddenly, the global market looked toward one country with stable resources, balanced infrastructure spending, and a clear fiscal plan, Canada. The laughter stopped overnight. Major tech firms, some from California, others from Singapore, began shifting their North American operations to Toronto and Calgary. Private jets were spotted landing in Ottawa as global CEOs requested emergency meetings with the Canadian government. In one leaked diplomatic cable, a U.S. trade official warned that Carney's so-called deficit plan might actually be an economic trap designed to pull investment north. The message was classified, but journalists caught wind of it. Carney didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. And then came the immigration shockwave. At first, reducing immigration numbers by almost half seemed like political suicide. Critics screamed that it would choke the labor market and fuel inflation. But then came the twist. Carney unveiled a fast-track residency program for 33,000 skilled foreign workers already living in Canada. Within days, industries like construction, healthcare, and AI research saw a surge in productivity. Data showed a 12% jump in domestic employment and a 9% drop in housing demand, something economists had been calling impossible just a month earlier. That's when global investors began calling the plan what it really was, a controlled reset. Meanwhile, the defense budget, criticized as bloated and reckless, was quietly changing the map of Canada's security alliances. The $81.8 billion defense package wasn't just about NATO. It included secret funding for what insiders dubbed Project Northern Shield, a cyber defense partnership involving Canadian, British, and Japanese intelligence agencies. A single line buried in page 312 of the budget read: Digital infrastructure modernization for sovereign autonomy. At first, no one noticed it. But after reports emerged that Canada's communication security establishment had blocked a massive cyber intrusion attempt, traced back to a foreign state actor, suddenly, that single line didn't seem so harmless. Carney's critics were stunned. The man they mocked as a banker in a politician's suit had quietly turned Canada into one of the most digitally fortified nations on Earth. Then, in mid-July, an even bigger story broke. Satellite images showed construction beginning along the Toronto-Quebec City high-speed rail line, 4 years ahead of schedule. Officials refused to explain how they'd secured early contracts or cleared environmental reviews so quickly. Some speculated that Carney's Major Projects Office had been operating behind the scenes long before he announced it. Others claimed that several private investors, including a mysterious consortium from the Gulf region, had already financed 40% of the project in exchange for future resource contracts. No one knew for sure. But what they did know was that Carney's impossible infrastructure plan was now very, very real. Then came the oil and gas miracle. When the budget hinted at possibly scrapping Canada's oil and gas emissions cap, environmentalists erupted in anger. But a month later, something astonishing happened. Canada's largest energy producers announced they'd voluntarily met emission targets 2 years ahead of schedule. How? The companies claimed they had been quietly investing in carbon capture tech, incentivized by secret early tax credits in Carney's budget. It was the perfect political twist. Carney looked like he'd lifted the cap, when in reality, he'd forced compliance through economics. By fall 2025, polls flipped overnight. The same media outlets that mocked Carney now called him the architect of the modern Canadian economy. Trump's trade advisors grew increasingly frustrated as American companies, especially green tech startups, migrated north to benefit from Canada's new productivity superdeduction law. Carney, when asked about it, simply smiled and said, "Business goes where vision lives." And then, just as it seemed everything had stabilized, another quiet shock hit the markets, a currency surge not seen since the early 2000s. For a brief 48 hours, the Canadian dollar surpassed the US dollar. Banks froze transactions. Analysts went silent. And Carney? He was nowhere to be seen. Rumors swirled that he was in a closed-door meeting with President Trump at Camp David. No details were ever confirmed. But the next day, both leaders released the same identical statement. North America's economic future will be guided by cooperation, not competition. What happened in that room, nobody knows. But after that, no one laughed at Carney's budget again. Months later, journalists would call it the Great Miscalculation. An 8% unemployment rate turned into 4.1%. Deficits began falling ahead of schedule. And that mysterious influx of foreign investment? It never stopped. Carney had done it. He'd turned ridicule into reality, and disbelief into dominance. They laughed at his budget. Until the world realized it wasn't a budget at all. It was a blueprint. A blueprint for a new Canada. Quietly built, strategically timed, and executed with precision only Mark Carney could deliver. And as the last lines of the 2025 fiscal report were read aloud in Parliament, even his critics stood in silence. Because everyone knew. The laughter was over. The era of Carney had begun.